I wanted to talk a bit about decolonization. I'm going to take a bit of like the national analysis of the NCPC and their Marxist-Leninist party. There is a great deal of information in the party program regarding the national question. The video on decolonization will be specifically on Quebec, and then maybe a section regarding like what then is there to be done for other settler colonial states. So in Canada, we have a confederation that forcibly puts together many different nations with one constitution, with one capitalist system that benefits a minority of capitalists. The cost of this is exploitation of labor here, and of course, because we're in the capitalist system, but most of all of labor abroad, because we are in the era of monopolist, imperialist capitalism. So who are these people who make up this present House of Nations? I'm going to make a more in-depth analysis in the future. But first of all, we have the broad category of indigenous peoples who are, people whose ancestors inhabited Turtle Island prior to colonization. We make a distinction between the Inuits, who are in the Great North, the Arctic Circle, who are also found in Alaska, and Russia, and in Greenland. In Quebec specifically, we have also 10 First Nations, who we distinguish from the Inuits on a linguistic basis, notably. This is reductive. It gets a bit deeper than that, but we have 10 communities divided into two major linguistic groups, the Algonquins and the Iroquois. The Iroquois refer to the Kanyen-Keaka communities and the Wendats, while the Algonquin group contains the Wabanaki, the Wolastoqiyik, the Inuk, the Anishinaabes, the Atikamekw Nehiyawisiwak, and the Iyu and Innu Crees, as well as Innus and Naskapi. And regarding Quebec City specifically, we are at the cross between the Dakina of the Wabanaki people, the Nitassinan of the Innu people, and the Nionwentsio of the Wendat people. Then we also have the various French Canadians or Franco-Canadians from the first wave of colonization. So this contains the Québécois, one of the largest nations in Canada. The Quebec question, historically, Quebec was a settler colonial state. Like the French were there to extract resources from the colony, so didn't have really an incentive to send lots of people. Like the interest of the French there was to trade with natives to in like very disadvantageous trade deals, to bring back products to the metropolis. And the British were there to extract, to populate these new areas, to expand their empire, and to tax this population and bring the profit back into the metropolis. And they had, therefore, an incentive to, systematically murder any fucking person who was in their way. And so Quebec, as a settler colony, ended up being exploited by this other wave of British colonization. Our people were working for meager wages in British factories. We didn't have really large scale Québécois francophone industry. It was possessed by the British industrialists and capitalists. Though we did have a national bourgeoisie at this time, absolutely. But it was a small portion of the intelligentsia, and it's ultimately was linked to the religious institutions. We had a period of revolutionary potentials in the 60s, but it was really nationalistic. The party that ultimately won that struggle was the Parti Québécois, who had a very anti-syndicalist line from the beginning. They were very anti-worker union. They wanted us as a Québécois nation to be above all. They thought that the struggle inside of Canada for Quebec independence was more important than actual worker unity. To ally ourselves with our national bourgeoisie in a sort of nationalist struggle. We have many contradictions, many dialectics here. There is the settler-colonial relation between the French, the Québécois, and the native populations. There's also the Anglophone, social chauvinist portrayal of Québécois. Right now, the Québécois are in a very in a much better position than we were in 60 years ago. And that was also at the expense of the Nitassinan, of the Innu people, by constructing hydroelectric dams on their territory, flooding it and killing people in the process, destroying their lands. So the assertion of our national identity was done largely on the back of natives. There are the Franco-Ontarians, Franco-Albertans. There's also the Acadian people. We also include the Anglo-Canadians, because Anglo-Canadians, or Canadians as a whole, does not refer to one nation. We are a prison house of nations, as I said. So there's no national unity here. We don't share a common language, a common culture, and this ties in with another group which we refer to as like the new wave migrants or immigrants, oftentimes people from the global south who come here because our country, well, imperialized them, participated in the bombings and sanctioning and exploitation of the people, and then they come here and they get super exploited. So oftentimes with the most dire circumstances, now a lot of them are here on like Tim Horton workers program, or where they sleep in really shitty conditions, like insanely long hours, not really any worker rights. They basically can't unionize. And the same goes for agricultural workers. We have an organism in Quebec, organization in Quebec, sorry, called RATMAC, Réseau d'aide aux travailleurs et travailleuses migrants agricoles du Québec. You have a huge region where we grow strawberries, and it's insanely hard labor to pick them up, all of them. So farms, this goes for corn, by the way, and other very high intensity crops. Corn is surprisingly hard to process. What the farmers, because the farmers are bourgeois, they're capitalists, what the capitalists do is command labor from people in the global south, usually Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Mexico. Most of them are Nicaraguan, actually, these programs. And they have an agreement as a syndicate, all of these farmers together. They even make like lists together that they share. They make sure that every firm's interest is looked at. They are a member of the l'Union des producteurs agricoles du Québec, the UPA, which is insanely reactionary. You have no idea how fucking reactionary they are. But it's to be expected because they're capitalists and they exploit migrant labor. And so these migrants, they come here on the promise that they are getting a job for the summer. A lot of the time they pay, like there is a long waiting list. They pay like $5,000 just to get a chance to go there. They have to pay their plane ticket. They have to pay for the temporary worker permit or something. They get there and they have insanely dire conditions. I've seen firsthand these conditions and it's absolutely abhorrent. They are forced to pay for union dues. However, since they're migrant labor and they're not like permanent employees, they cannot benefit from defense from the syndicate, from the union, from the worker union. And if they so much so as defy an order from the boss, if they so much so as mention the possibility of organizing together as workers to demand better conditions, to demand better pay, to demand shorter hours, they get sent back to Nicaragua or to the country they are from. And what happens then? They get put on the blacklist, so the capitalist just puts them on the blacklist and boom, they're not allowed to return. Oftentimes, these people endure abuse. They are forced to work through incredible injuries against the recommendation of doctors. By the way, they have to pay for their healthcare because they are not eligible for the state public healthcare. What the RATMAC does is give judicial help to these people. All in all, the state enables this behavior from the capitalists. That's pretty much the condition of like these workers. But there are work programs by Tim Hortons and McDonald's to recruit labor abroad. And people are stuck in these closed contracts where they cannot go against anything their boss says. And a lot of the time, like they come from like India, the Philippines, or countries which have like abhorrent conditions at home because of neoliberal policies, because of the capitalist exploitation of their resources. It's insanely exploitative. And you have all these reactionaries bitching about how immigrants are coming into this country. Like, do they not realize that the people commanding this labor are like white capitalists from the class they keep defending? Like it's not a scheme for immigrants to come into this country, which, by the way, we're all colonizers. So why do you care if someone else comes onto the same piece of land as you when your ancestors killed indigenous people to acquire it? To summarize, there are the First Nations, the Inuits, the Métis, the Anglo-Canadians, the Franco-Canadians, the Québécois, the Acadiens, and the New Wave migrants. And so it doesn't really matter how many nations we can list or whatever. It doesn't change from the fact that this is a present House of Nations who don't have self-determination. We're going to talk about the Indian Act in another video, but do know that the Canadian federal government still very much so operates in a settler colonial genocidal manner. No matter the amount of reconciliation or reparation rhetoric they put on the national media, it's fucking token land acknowledgements. You're gonna be here in Quebec in a fucking like event, like a Rubik's Cube event or whatever the fuck in Quebec City, and you're gonna say, oh, on reconnaît que on est sur une terre non cédée, c'est-à-dire la croisée du Ndakinak du peuple Abénaki, du Nyanwentsio du peuple Wendat Huron, et du Nitassinan du peuple Innu. Like, you say this land. I mean, it's very correct. It's okay to acknowledge land. It's something that should be done. But it's not an end-all be-all. You don't just recognize the land and then continue to occupy it without challenging the system. It's tokenism, and ultimately it leads people towards like thinking that decolonization is just vague reconciliation, and they don't define reconciliation. They just think it's everyone's gonna be happy, and no, you have to challenge the structures in place. There is systematic policy of erasure of native people, notably through the reserve system. So we are very much still in the colonialist epoch. We are in a colonial era. We have not decolonized. We are not post-colonial. We still do benefit from settler-indigenous relations. And these relations must be abolished via the crushing of the Canadian settler colonial genocidal state. I think the strategy for this, as Québécois workers, is to ally ourselves with Indigenous people from the working class. And I think it's really important to convey the point that it's not, when you talk about listening to native voices or propping up native voices, it's not the few privileged individuals or the compradors or the capitalists from these nations, because these people don't represent the interest of their national proletariat, their actual oppressed members of the nations, because the compradors ultimately benefit from colonialism and from the occupation. Listen to Indigenous voices as a broad thing. I mean, yes, of course, listen to Indigenous voices, but don't listen to the comprador business owners who exploit labor, who own apartment buildings. I mean, the compradors are one part. Like, it's like listening, saying you're gonna listen to Cubans and then it's a white Cuban from Miami. It's not exactly the same thing. The person's still Indigenous, but what happened is the federal government completely dismissed the traditional mode of governance by Indigenous nations, imposed like a chief on every nation, always a man, by the way. And some of these chiefs and some artists or some people are put on a pedestal to the detriment of others as compradors, as commanders of labor, and a lot of entrepreneurs, you know. That's the thing. There is a comprador class. So there's class elements in all of these nations. The way to decolonize is not this bourgeois way of thinking, and then you proceed to fucking not do anything and uphold capitalist relations by saying like, oh yeah, reconciliation is very important. Now I'm gonna give like migrant labor to an indigenous comprador. At some point, people have got to realize that you don't reconcile settler colonial nations with indigenous people in the framework of a capitalist system that exploits the land and destroys it. What's important here is to build socialism, and how we do this, there's 2 points to this. How do we achieve it? Like, what is the strategy here? What is the role of indigenous people? And 3, how it works post-revolution. First, it is important that the workers of all nations unite together against the capitalist class. This means indigenous workers against the compradors and the bourgeoisie, indigenous workers together, Québécois workers together, and Anglophone workers together, and all these groups together in a united front. Not a united front in the sense of like a broad coalition of leftists, you know? I mean, as united nations together against capitalism. Maybe the United Nations is not the best term to put it. I've got to realize that we're all proletarian. We're all proletarian, except those who are not, like workers and progressive elements of the descendant of settlers, immigrants, and indigenous workers together against the capitalist state.
So to summarize this first point, it's a common struggle waged shoulder to shoulder with indigenous people, and we need to put forward their voices in this struggle, of course. And the last point is like how this all works post-revolution. It's pretty simple. It's a house of nations. I'll do proper analysis in a second time. And this evidently has to be advanced as a struggle against the American state and as an eventual reconciler of like all the peoples of North America. The real main takeaway here is that you can't decolonize or have land back if the capitalist system is still in place. And the only way to achieve this is with a socialist revolution. And from there on, once the extractivist capitalist relations of production are done away with, now we can talk about proper land back. Now we can talk about decolonization. Now we can talk about reconciliation. So I hope this was at least informative. I'm currently writing a proper analysis. This was just an amalgamation of different stream clips. And as a final note, I want to read this text written by Cherokee comrades singing Redbird from the Anti-Revisionist Educational Society. What is land back? Land back is the fight for each native nation to have its land and have the right to self-determination. The goal once a nation is established is decolonization. What is decolonization? It is the process of removing harmful settler structures, for example, religious institutions, English names, toponyms, the list goes on, and relations. The goal of decolonization is to remove the contradictions of the native states and the settler states. What are these contradictions? The native nations want their land back. The settler state does not want this, for it weakens the settler state. The native neocolonies want to be economically independent. The settler state cannot have this, for the settler state would have less power. The ability to decide who can become a citizen. The settler state cannot have this, for that ensures the survival of the natives, and it would lose a worker from their factory to another. All of this falls under self-determination, which requires land back. The settler state would never allow this. How do we remove these contradictions? Well, the removal of the settler state. What happens to the settlers? Well, they stay in whatever nation they are. For example, Tennessee would be Cherokee land. The American workers would stay there and would have equal say in the nation, but their privileges are removed. The only way to achieve this is socialism. What replaces the USA? Here we can also talk about Canada. A union of all nations that still exist. What can I do? And then specifically, I think the thing to do is to join your local worker council, a communist org, as long as they're principled, and actually work towards dismantling this capitalist state.